Okay. Hi, John. How are you doing? It's good
Hi,
to be
great,
here.
Paul.
Yeah, great. All right. So we're here to talk about emergence and related issues, and we thought we'd start with John just giving a little bit of historical background to the area. John, do you want to kick it off?
Sure, sure. So we're going to be talking about emergent properties, and what we'll do is we'll sort of sketch some of the early history of emergence. We'll talk maybe about the role of emergence in philosophy of mind, and I guess our ultimate destination is to try and make some connections between the metaphysics of science, literature, or the sort of philosophy of science, life of the concept of emergence, and the metaphysical questions that are of
Hmm.
interest to philosophers.
Right.
So I guess the concept of emergence, of course, has a sort of a not a very happy reputation, due, I suppose we say, in large part to the early exponents of the view, people like Broad and Alexander, who have fallen into some disrepute over the years. I think maybe Paul, you'd like to jump in here. I mean, the idea was that at this point in the early 20th century, um, philosophers were looking for some middle ground between a kind of materialism that seemed to preclude properties associated with life, consciousness, and other phenomena,
Hmm.
and they looked for a middle ground between that and the kind of vitalism that they were clearly rejecting. So the early emergentists were cautious with respect to various kinds of substance dualist accounts, the kinds of vitalism that people like Bergson and others would have advocated for.
Yeah, and that's actually part of the history I think that people haven't explored enough, in that there's a lot of attention paid to the British emergentists, starting with Mill, and then, as you said, Broad and Alexander and so forth. But there's this somewhat more mystical strain that came out of the French movement in the early 20th century, and I think that was one of the things that turned a lot of people away from emergentism, together with what I think is widely recognised as a perhaps mistaken view that the advances in quantum theory and later in molecular biology had erased all of the interesting possibilities for examples of emergence in chemistry and biology. And then, interestingly, in my view, I think that turned out to be exactly wrong, and we're now back at the beginning of the 21st century with some extremely interesting potential examples of emergence, and more of them seem to be coming out every year. So it's an exciting time to be looking into this.
Sure, and some of the other features for the decline, or reasons for the decline in the popularity of the concept of emergence, I think have to do with the increasingly sophisticated articulation of the concept of emergence, or sorry, of explanation among philosophers. So there is in the famous Hempel and Oppenheim paper from '48, whose name I've just forgotten. There's an extended
Studies in the logic of explanation, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Mhm.
There's an extended criticism of the explanatory function of the concept of emergence, which I think is had significant impact in
It did, and that's also something that I think people ought to read more, because it's not often mentioned when people talk about that seminal paper. And it's like most of Hempel's stuff. It's very interesting. And then of course you get the sort of theoretical tradition, starting with Ernest Nagel's account of reduction, in which reduction really seemed to hold out a lot of promise. And since there's this widely held view that reduction makes emergence impossible, then once that got going, then I think emergence simply just died on the vine for a while.
Right, right. So you see, for example, if you study the citations or the mentions of the term emergence, they drop off dramatically immediately following those criticisms. So things get back up and running again in earnest among philosophers, I think, in the '90s, and in large part this is due to growing discontent with non-reductive physicalism, and the suspicion among folks like Kim that standard articulations of non-reductive physicalism ended up looking a lot like the less reputable parts of emergence. And
Yes,
so,
indeed.
right, so Kim then, as just to sort of bring us up to date, Kim's arguments in the 90s had to do with the apparently sort of self-contradictory or self-undermining nature of emergent properties. So genuinely, quote-unquote, genuinely emergent properties seemed to be involved in this kind of self-causation. So these sort of synchronic downward causal properties that they manifested seemed to be a kind of Baron von Munchausen phenomenon, where the property or the emergent property that was identified with the whole was involved in some sort of self-causing and unacceptably paradoxical, according to Kim, form of self-causation.
Yeah, that's entirely right. And ironically, I think Kim's work, I think, was partly responsible for getting a number of people interested in the topic of emergence, even though he himself doesn't think there's much room for it.
Exactly.
But I think it's also worth mentioning some of the influences from outside philosophy that have got people interested in emergence again. And one of the strongest influences there is from the area of computational models and complex systems and self-organization and so forth, which really do seem to have generated a number of examples that are intriguing and at least plausible candidates for emergence.
Yeah, so we could talk a little bit about that. I think this might be an occasion to say something about the intersection between these kinds of fundamental metaphysical questions that have traditionally been associated with the concept of emergence, and some of the points from the philosophy of science. So we could say something maybe about fusion here. So if you'd like to, I could sort of set you up. Paul's
Okay,
articles.
so let me say something about that. What I see as a tension between the philosophical approaches and some of the scientific approaches, in that for good or ill, most of the attention in philosophy tended to be within the philosophy of mind on whether consciousness and related phenomena were candidates for emergence. Whereas there were a number of other people who believed that if you were going to make any sense of emergence at all, it was likely to be far lower down the scale, somewhere in fundamental physics, where people had floated phase transitions, for example, as possible examples of emergence, and so forth. And just speaking from my own perspective, it was Kim's exclusion argument that got me interested in the area. And one thing that struck me was that so much of this work that was based on supervenience and so forth was a legacy of a sort of atomistic view, where you got combinatorial views of building up high levels from lower levels. And the line that I eventually ended taking was to see what happened if, in fact, you rejected some of the tenets of atomism, in particular the idea that atoms were permanent, and to see what happened if, in fact, things, and especially properties, could actually go out of existence and combine into genuinely new properties. And this certainly seems at least like a metaphysical possibility. And I believe that the commonly cited example of entanglement in quantum mechanics is indeed exactly an example of that kind of thing, where what used to be at the lower level no longer exists, and you now have a sort of fused and inextricably linked new state, which can't be decomposed into parts in the way that atomistic views tend to think they can.
Good. Good, good. So I guess then you could say that. Well, maybe at this point we should say something. I realize we haven't given any kind of definition. Of course, this is a difficult thing to do of emergence, but just sort of as a broad introduction to what we're talking about. I mean, what would be the defining properties then of an emergent property? So presumably it would have to do with some. Presumably it has to do with the explanation on the one hand, and we could talk a little bit about composition, especially with respect to your fusion example. So
Well,
explanation, prediction.
Maybe you can. Yeah, maybe you can tell me if you agree with this. That I don't believe that there is a commonly agreed upon definition of emergence, and in my view, it's not likely to be one on the scene for a while. Is that something that you would agree with?
I'm glad we have something to disagree about. So I think that one sort of common feature among all of the various uses of the concept of emergence is the idea that there are two sort of distinct kinds of things, right? The more fundamental, basal, whatever they are, properties or level, and the somehow less fundamental properties that we call emergent, that are somehow related to the more fundamental, but not in a sort of standard reductive way. So I think the idea of more and less fundamental is shared throughout all these uses of emergence, and I think also the idea that emergent properties are emergent relative to that more fundamental set of properties. So I think that would be one that would cut across all of the various uses of emergence. So just at least, I mean, that's a very minimal kind of characterization of emergence, but that I think would hold true for all.
Yeah, although I of course, you recognise that doesn't really come all that close to being a sufficient condition for something to be emergent, and we should also mention, I think, at this point, that there are two broad traditions here. One is the ontological tradition in emergence, which wants to stay very close to the issue of whether there are real features of the world which are irreducible to, as you said, the lower levels of the world. And then on the other hand, you have this epistemological tradition in which unpredictability is really the central notion, and that is not committed in any way to the existence of ontological emergence as giving rise to
exactly. So I think that would be the principal difference then between the various accounts of emergence is the sort of the meatiness or the content or the reality that's attached to the emergent properties, and that's going to vary depending on the view. I think I think there is actually more to. There is. Obviously, it's not sufficient to characterize all of them, but the common characteristic of all these accounts of emergence is I think some assumption about more and less fundamental, and that the emergent property is emergent relative to some more fundamental level or set of properties.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that second feature, because it's something that is often overlooked or not mentioned, and that it has to be specified from which the emergent features are emerging, and without that it's hard to assess whether or not the emergence claim is correct.
Okay, and so I think that cuts across all of the sort of prominent uses of the concept of emergence in at least that I'm familiar with. So I think we could say something about how the debate shifted away from philosophy of mind. I think we've already mentioned that for both of us the kinds of arguments that Kim made in the 90s were important. But I mean, as you've already indicated, they come with an awful lot of metaphysical baggage. You were pointing to atomism as one of the big assumptions. There's also sort of a more general metaphysical fundamentalism that seems to be at play in that kind of physicalist characterization of emergence from the 90s in philosophy of mind. But maybe we could talk a little bit about how the debate has moved away from philosophy of mind and into philosophy of science. So I think this is a topic that well, it's something I'm very interested in. So.
Good, yeah. Well, certainly the kind of examples that I mentioned earlier of self-organizing systems, I think are beautiful examples of where to look for the possibility of emergence when it's connected to another characteristic which has traditionally been around, and that is in terms of global or holistic properties of the system that cannot be reduced to properties of the parts. And interestingly, I think that there's now starting to be a body of literature in the social sciences where when people, for example, are talking about group intentionality, as a feature of the group as a whole, that can't be reduced to intentional properties of the members of the group. And that's another area where the holistic features seem to reflect this tradition in emergence that goes all the way back to the early British emergentists. Sure.
I think the holism is very very traditional, right? So that's a concept that's traditionally been associated with emergence. I'll mention a few other points from the social sciences that maybe haven't gotten their due. And here I'm thinking about a general, let's say, feature of reasoning in the social sciences, where, let's say, even all the way back to the notion of a social fact in the very origins of social science, these social phenomena are thought to be, in some sense, real enough to study, and that they have some kind of causal role and some sort of, at the very least, explanatory role. And so, when one of the points that some researchers are looking at, including Georges Lossa, David Rodriguez, and I, some of us are looking at, how we can account for the appearance of these kinds of social facts. Let's say, for example, we take a concept like a territory. A territory is in some sense a combination of social the social relations among a population and the use of space in that population. So here we are, or here I am, on the border with Mexico, and the border is in some sense, of course, completely arbitrary and conventional, but on the other hand, it plays an important role in the lives of the people who live here. And so then we could ask, I think, and this is important for the social sciences and maybe the special sciences more generally, is when we're talking about something like a territory or a border, what counts, what gives it whatever reality it has, or how do we give an account of the appearance of these kinds of objects or phenomena? And so what Georges, David, and I had looked at is the idea that if you can couple two networks, let's say a standard social network and, let's say, for example, in our case, a very simple cellular automata, and then measured how they interacted, looked at how the agents interacted in the cellular automata as a function of their dynamic social interactions, we could maybe detect some feature which we call territory, which then acts back on the social and the geographical behavior of agents. So that kind of thing would be, this might lead us into the discussion of computational modeling strategies, but all I'm saying here is that, the holist story is not the only one for these kinds of emergent social properties.
Yeah,
think
I agree with that. And the notoriously tangled issue of downwards causation is ever present here as well.
Exactly.
But by holistic features, I meant nothing more than a sort of catch-all term for these, because another interesting type of example in the social sciences is where you have an organization, a corporation or something like that, which persists, even though the individual members of it go through a complete turnover, so that the people who are working in the company now are completely different from the people who are working for the company 50 years ago, yet there's some sense in which it's the same company, at least in terms of the culture of the company, and that culture does have some sort of constraining effect on what people within the company do. So I don't know whether that is actually downwards causation or contextual causation or something else, but it gives you an example where the individuals that supposedly in the old tradition make up the corporation are somehow not crucial to the continued existence of the organization. Does that make sense?
Sure. So I think then we could say a little bit about how these kinds of emergence stories differ from standard non-reductive materialist accounts of those kinds of phenomena, like that, let's say, a functionalist might give, where you don't really need the same, where we could sort of functionally individuate the concept without giving too much ontological weight to our individuating the concept. So that
yes, that's right. Which surely indicates that, although of course you need individuals there, who they are is largely irrelevant, and so there has to be some sort of autonomy to the higher level, which is exactly what emergentists want.
Sure. And I think this maybe brings us back to Kim's criticism of non-reductive physicalist accounts of these kinds of things, because he said really the question is how much ontological heft these things really have, and on his account, of course, they don't have any, and so this would be a parallel with the distinction between a sort of an ontological and epistemological account of emergent phenomena. So maybe we're getting to what's really critical here, which is, at least from my perspective, the ontological defense of a sort of a stronger ontological account of emergent properties. So.
Yeah, and again, here's a point which, tell me if you disagree with it or not, but I think that issue is something which computational modeling has a certain difficulty in addressing, because in real corporations you have these quasi-causal constraining effects, but the very nature of the combinatorial features of computational models makes it hard to escape from the sort of mereological position that emergentists want to get away from. Do you agree with that?
Well, I'm not sure. I think we could talk about the general lack of any kind of ontological insight that would be provided by computational models. So I certainly don't think that a computational model of these things is especially illuminating. So this is a work that I've tried to develop in detail in a 2008 paper. So I don't think that the computational models will shed an awful lot of light on these questions, on the ontological questions, independently of real philosophical work. But maybe you had more in mind than that.
I agree with that. They can be wonderfully suggestive, I think, of directions to go in, but the metaphysics is going to be either a matter for experiment or for philosophical investigation. But let me say one more thing about computational models and associated activities. I mentioned the ontological tradition in emergence and the epistemological tradition. I think there's something else that tracks emergence, and that is the conceptual organization that you use to represent, let's say, clusters of objects which otherwise are taken to be individuals. So that, as we all know, you take a given cluster of individuals, you can group them one way according to one set of concepts, and group them another way according to a second set of concepts. And that choice of conceptual representation, I think, is lurking behind what some people want from emergence. That they see that there are special categories that some of biological sciences use, some of the social sciences use, and you can't do without them. And I think that that's what some people see as constituting the autonomy of some of biological and social sciences. Now, whether that's strong enough to count as emergence in the terms of the features that you mentioned earlier, that's a subject for a long discussion. But the conceptual features here, I think, need to be brought out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you have a particular case in mind?
Well, yeah, especially in computational models where you start out in agent-based models with explicitly programmed features of the agents that are in there. But then you start seeing these interesting patterns in the products of the simulations and the other models, and you get interesting groupings of the agents which you wouldn't otherwise be aware of if you hadn't run the model.
Right.
And it's at that point that you are forced to confront the issue. Well, is there something going on here at a level that proceeds at higher than the individual? And if it is, what are we going to call it? Is it stable enough to count as a persistent, interesting phenomenon, and so forth? That's what I'm thinking of here.
Great. Well, I think the point about agent-based modeling is extremely interesting, and one way I would sort of slightly, or maybe an aspect I'd draw attention to would be when you're looking at the way philosophers of mind or metaphysicians think about emergence.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have a very we have a sort of a homogeneous or relatively homogeneous picture of the fundamental level, whatever that fundamental level is.
Mm-hmm.
By contrast, the models that are involved in the models that you have in mind, these kinds of agent-based models, to begin with, agents are diverse. So the basic constituents of an agent-based model can be set up to be, diverse in some important way. So they can either come in different kinds or follow slightly different rules or be governed by different parameters, etc. And that diversity is critically important to the way the system unfolds. Likewise, so as opposed to a kind of a view of the basic constituents as homogeneous, the agent-based models are heterogeneous. So if we think, for example, of complexity and think of sort of the foundational assumptions in complexity, I think diversity is diversity at the fundamental level might be one of them. Of course, adaptive behavior, interaction, etc. Those would be other features of complex systems. But I think one reason that complexity and agent-based modeling, etc., are such happy homes for the concept of emergence is that their basic constituents are diverse. They're not homogeneous in a way that this kind of autonomous.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that, because it reminds me that I just need to mention another dimension of emergence, and it's this, that far too much of the philosophical literature, partly because it came out of this focus on the relation between the brain and the mind, far too much of that was focused on synchronic emergence. Whereas most of the interesting phenomenon that you've just been mentioning, the development of complex adaptive agents and agent-based models in general with diverse agents. What you've got there is the development of emergent phenomena over the course of time, which is diachronic emergence, and that's something that has been under-discussed, and I think there's a tremendous amount of potential for interesting cases of emergence right there.
Sure, sure. And I think, I mean, the sort of the basic idea of emergence is some notion of novelty, right? It includes some notion of novelty, and novelty, of course, is, somehow inextricably diachronic, right? There was a before and an after. So I think the reason folks in philosophy of mind focused so tightly on synchronic downward causation, for example, is that it does seem to get to the heart of the metaphysical problem and the sort of sense of getting something for nothing, or the kind of Baron von Munchausen feature of the thing. But and I think part of that, of course, had to do with the worry about individuation, because if the way you individuate is via unique causal powers, and if it turns out that your constituents have the monopoly on causal powers, then you're not going to be able to legitimately individuate the emergent properties. So it's understandable, but I mean,
and also I think just going back to the sort of atomistic influences on these things, I think the reason why people just were not interested in diachronic emergence is that this combinatorial view leads you to think that there can't be anything interestingly novel there. It's just rearranging the same atomistic constituents. But when you've got the opportunity for real interaction between these things and changing their properties, as you mentioned, either with fusion or with the adaptive agents in a computer model, then that opens up a completely different dimension for looking at how you can get novelty in the temporal direction.
Okay, great. Would you like to say a little bit about individuation? I'm curious to see whether you think it's that big of a deal ultimately, or whether that part of the metaphysical story you'd want to leave back in the 90s.
Individuation of what?
Let's say of emergent properties. So what would be the criteria for individuating an emergent property?
Well...
if not, let's say, if not a sort of standard story about novel causal powers or unique causal powers.
Well, that would be the place to start, wouldn't it? Because, after all, I mean, there's a standard metaphysical tradition in taking the... literally the identity of a property as being in terms of the causal powers that it has. But if one doesn't want to do that, maybe because you think that somehow the Kim-style arguments have made emergent properties causally impotent or something, then I think you're forced in the direction of analysing, what the conceptual resources that you're bringing to bear at that higher level have to be, and then perhaps it becomes a sort of functionalist account. Maybe it turns into a sort of pragmatically driven view, but we do have resources for deciding when a particular sort of grouping of properties is worth pursuing and when we don't. Isn't that true?
Well, yeah. In practice, of course, that's we're going to have to fall back in practice on those kinds of criteria. I wonder if by doing that, though, we sort of miss the metaphysically interesting features, if there are such, of emergent properties, or whether we might want to reconsider, more basic characterizations of the quote unquote fundamental level. So
but
I'm not
of course
sure.
one can't sensibly discuss this without having a prior commitment as to whether one is talking about ontological emergence or some other kind, because surely the sort of thing that you're after, and it's a very interesting and legitimate goal to pursue, has got to be done within the ontological tradition, and
Right.
that means, and excuse my certain realist bias here, that the world is going to make up its mind which of those emergent properties, where they shear off from other emergent properties. It's not up to us to be deciding that, is it?
Right. Well, right.
Whereas you see within the computational models, I think
Mm-hmm.
there's considerably more freedom for conventional decisions as to how we want to order the world at the so-called higher levels. Where one falls in the social realm, of course, is dependent on something you said earlier, which is one's view on the existence or non-existence of objective social facts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I think the concern about not really tackling the ontological question is that you end up with a certain level of arbitrariness with respect to sort of carving the phenomenon at the joints or not, and I guess it's connected to more intuitive worries or earlier worries
Yeah.
about the reality of emergent properties, and that if I guess what's motivating this obviously is concerns that if the Kim style arguments go through, then a lot of things that we would hold to be real would actually not be real, et cetera, and so that's part of the motivation. But I think if we slightly shift, and I mean obviously this is a huge move, but let's take for example the attitude towards the basic constituents of your models or your theories. If we slightly shift our view of that, let's say along the lines that complexity scientists might take, then emergence is nearly ubiquitous. We get all kinds of novelty that appears very quickly once we assume a diversity of the basic agents.
That's right, and that I think is a danger that one wants to avoid. I mean, there are philosophers. I think Bill Wimsatt is an example of this, who seems to be quite happy with emergence being an extremely common phenomenon. Mm-hmm. That makes people feel uncomfortable. But here's one way to address it. So let's go back to the issue that you discussed shortly after we got going, and that is the existence or otherwise of various levels in the ontological hierarchy. Well, whether or not emergent properties are identifiable as objective or conventional surely depends on whether one thinks that you can make objective sense or not of the existence of these levels. And
right.
It's I think it's a striking fact that in physics there's a widely held view that there are stable phenomena that seem to appear at certain discrete parts of the energy spectrum, and
Mm-hmm.
that those seem to be real features of the world. You can't get
Mm-hmm.
those stable features at anything that we think of as lower in the hierarchy, and then when you go up, you get different sort of stable features appearing. And so the phenomenon of rigidity, for example, really doesn't make a whole lot of sense down at the level of fundamental particles. So you have to go up the hierarchy, and if there's an identifiable sort of physically meaningful point at which those sorts of things begin to exist, then I think that gives you an objectivity, and it's not just conventional.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think the recent paper by Margaret Morrison discussing the renormalization group equations makes more or less that point. So so I think that's very important. So by contrast, let's say the kinds of accounts of these phenomena that focus on explanatory features or just the formal features, I think kind of miss the ontological interests. So so I think that's perfectly reasonable. So notice that in that story you don't get the kinds of fundamentalist assumptions about reality that philosophers would normally project onto these debates. So
Yes,
in,
and which
yeah.
they shouldn't be, because a dangerous trend here is for philosophers to start legislating what the ontology of the world should be. And that's exactly what one shouldn't do when you start looking at these rather more finely grained scientific examples, whether they're in chemistry or biology or whatever.
Okay, so I think it's when we philosophers look at physical phenomena, we tend to think that the most basic constituents compositionally would also be sort of mapped cleanly onto what's most fundamental or most real, and I think I don't know if Morrison would go this far, but clearly her well, as I read it, her paper certainly makes the case that we, using these techniques like renormalization, we can actually identify things that are just as real, and but not at the most compositionally basic level. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be a big deal if it were the case. So I mean, I'm sympathetic to that view.
Right.
So let me ask. Go ahead.
Do you want to maybe spend the time that we have left looking ahead a bit and maybe speculating a little bit about where you think promising directions in this area?
Well, I've done quite a bit of speculation already. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about complexity. But maybe I'm actually very curious to hear what you have to say about the future, Paul.
Well, please go ahead. Let me just say something briefly, and then I'll let you go, and I'll maybe come back. And it's this. I'm happy to see that this monomania with consciousness and so forth is dropping away, and that people are exploring other areas. And I do think that for philosophers of science, looking at what complexity theory has to offer is tremendously rich vein to be mined here. Just the one area of neural networks and the possibility of discovering what look like plausible candidates for emergent phenomena there is an area which I think young philosophers really should be eager to get into. But the more general area of theoretical results in complexity theory, where you do find stable patterns emerging from certain kinds of interactions and that sort of thing, all those are a rich source of philosophical possibilities, and we should be making more use of them. But you wanted to say something about complexity theory too, I think.
Yeah, well, I agree with what you've said. I think the where I'm maybe more old-fashioned in some ways is I think we still have these very basic metaphysical questions to tackle, and I think questions about fundamentality and the debates that are now going on in metaphysics between folks who are arguing for anti-fundamentalist positions like Schaeffer and others who are sort of defending a sort of fundamentalism in metaphysics. Those have. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to play out or what effect it'll have on the debates about emergence. But depending on how those debates settle out or who's right, it'll have enormous consequences for those basic questions about individuation and reality that many of us are still obsessed with, even though we're also looking at these nice cases in the sciences. So my general view is that that while obviously the scientific investigation is extraordinarily fruitful and interesting, some of those kinds of questions that motivated people from the get-go with respect to emergence won't be answered outside of the philosophy seminar room. So, and I think the kinds of discussions that Schaeffer, Sider, and others are currently engaged in will have direct consequence for at least what we're calling the ontological tradition in emergence. And so sort of wait and see how these debates settle out, and in the meantime, keep working on these nice network models.
Yeah, although I feel compelled to get up on a hobby horse for a minute here, and that is that there's got to be an informed interaction between metaphysicians and philosophers of science on this issue, because emergence is not the baby of either one of them. And
right.
What I mean by that is that you're absolutely right that just looking at scientific examples and results is not going to, by itself, be terribly informative about what emergence is and should be. But one shouldn't be conducting investigations into these areas of metaphysics in an a priori fashion either, because it's got to be constrained by the kinds of real results that people have found out there. And one thing that I would just like to finish my sort of half of the talk on is that you've got these purely theoretical investigations into emergence, which of course are fascinating and interesting, and I've certainly indulged myself in those. But what I find that people tend to end up wanting to know is, are there real examples of emergence out there in the world? Maybe it's consciousness, maybe it's phase transitions in physics, but there've got to be some examples, otherwise the subject is fairly empty. And so the dual tracks of doing metaphysical investigations combined with serious scientific work, I think, is the appropriate way to
definitely
approach this topic.
So for example, I mean, one strategy that scientists interested in complexity might opt for would be to try and discover emergent properties rather than what we philosophers have been doing, which is to pick our favorite emergent properties and then defend them to death. So it's maybe at least of more evidential value, perhaps, to sort of say, well, look, we can find these effects. Effects, for example, in interacting networks. Let's say the relationship, or how these phenomena can simultaneously act on the two networks that they I suppose that serve as the basis for these phenomena. I mean, let's say we were to discover features of the behavior of networks like Facebook, for example, on our economic behavior, and how those network phenomena interact. And let's say in the process we were to discover some new features that acted on both the social and the economic behavior of the agents. That would be interesting, and there are real possibilities there, I think. So I think that would combine the two worlds in a way that you're looking for. That it would be a kind of an a posteriori discovery of how things could emerge, and these would be things that we hadn't previously identified or hadn't previously been committed to. I think that would be it. Where just to go back to my sort of old-fashioned nature, I mean, I don't think that we're going to have an awful lot of informative or many informative results on a question like individuation, like what makes something count as something, as an individual. I think that would be a domain where philosophers would be the ones who'd take the lead. I mean, in complexity, for example, there's active discussion over the past 10 years having to do with measures of complexity, etc. But I mean, those might be informative, but ultimately they're not going to, I think, settle the matter as to what counts as a genuine individual, a real thing. But as you said, the point you made earlier about nature settling those questions is well taken too. So
yeah.
So
one last thing I think is that people should ask themselves what it is that they want from emergence, and I think the answer to that is very frequently what you get when you realize that reduction is failing. So that this very old contrast between reducible systems and systems that exhibit emergence rarely goes away. And now that there's a fairly widespread recognition that reduction is nowhere near as common or easily got as people once thought it was, the thing to do is people start asking, well, okay, so we can't get reduction, so what is it that we get? And maybe some of those things look like what people want from emergence. Maybe there's something else, and so perhaps there's an intermediate area between full reduction and rather pure cases of emergence. But if there is, that's another interesting area to look at, because I'm not quite sure what's in there, but it's likely to be an increasingly important role in scientific activity.
Great. I think on that note, maybe we should wrap things up. It's been a pleasure.
Good. Well, I enjoyed it, as always. Nice talking to you. And
Too.
Hope the viewers like it as well.
Great.